Fisher, who has collaborated extensively with Mark Clements, who is a microbiologist, professor in science education at the University of Lincoln. They've worked together for 5 years. Melissa graduated from the MA Maths and Science here at Central St Martin's last year. So this time last year, you were about to have your final degree shown. So for the past 5 years, they have worked together to create a series of living sculptures, revealing the invisible microflora of the human skin. They've contributed to Invisible You, a Wellcome Trust funded human microbiome exhibition at the Eden Project in Cornwall, which is a 5-year exhibition, which is 2 years in. So you've still got 3 more years to get to Cornwall to the Eden Project to see their contribution to Invisible You. More recently, they have been commissioned by a production company to create a life-size human bacterial sculpture for a BBC documentary on antimicrobial resistance, and that's to be broadcast very soon. So they're going to talk about negotiated practice between artists and scientists and external commissioning bodies. Over to Melissa and Mark.
So, as Heather said, I'm Mel, and I'm an artist that's interested in living organisms and bacteria in particular. And in the past, we have made bacteria sculptures of parts of my body. I think I'm just saying. But I'm interested in questioning what makes us human, and also questioning our connection with nature and what and how beautiful bacteria is, as well as how vital it is to us.
Yeah, so I'm Mark, and as Heather said, then I'm a Professor of Science Education at the University of Lincoln, but my research background is actually in microbiology. And so Mel and I first met over 5 years ago, and that was on Broad Vision at the University of Westminster, initiative led by Heather here, and I was the bioscience lead, and at the time Mel was an illustration student, and we started to collaborate at that stage, and it's good to see quite a few familiar faces from all the way back then. And so when we were working together on the project, then Mel came up to me and then asked me whether it's possible to sculpt with agar. And so agar is a jelly-like substance that we use in the lab to grow bacteria. So it contains nutrients and it grows the bacteria. And we always use it in Petri dishes. And so Mel comes along and then says, yeah, can I sculpt with it? I said, I don't know, nobody's ever tried, we just brought up those dishes. And that's where our collaboration actually started from.
So once we'd established that collaboration and the method and the process, we started to explore more avenues, and we eventually applied for the Eden Project Invisible You process. And yeah, it's been on for 2 years now, and this was the phase probably about 2-3 days after we made it, and then after 1 year, it looks like that. So pretty.
Yeah. So these faces are taking the bacteria from Mel's skin and then growing them on the surface of these wonderful sculptures.
So I graduated from MA Art Science here a year ago now, which is weird. And my original ambition for my MA was to make a life-size sculpture of myself. And then in my second year, probably about 5 months before I was meant to graduate, Mark decided to leave London and told me at one of these events actually.
Yeah,
I went off and cried.
Yeah. Talking about the memory.
You know, you start a really good job, and yeah.
So I left. Left rather sort of relieved as well, because at that point Mel was saying that she wanted to create a life-size sculpture, and I had no clue how we were going to achieve that. The logistics of it are an absolute nightmare, and we had no funding to do it. So from my point of view, it was a good parting point.
But we're back together now.
Yes.
So we are here today to talk to you about a project that we've been working on. We've had to keep quiet, so I feel really weird actually talking about it. So we were commissioned by a production company called Renegade Pictures to produce a life-size agar bacteria sculpture, and we're quite tired from it still, I think.
Yes.
So we're going to tell you about the work leading up to its creation.
Yeah, and so Renegade Pictures first contacted Mel. They'd seen the work at the Eden Project. They were really interested. They had an idea that they wanted to produce a documentary about antimicrobial resistance, but didn't really know how they were going to bring that to life. And so then that's when Mel first started to talk to them, gave them lots and lots of ideas, probably a bit too many ideas, because then they came knocking on my door as a scientist saying, oh, is it possible to do this? Mel said that we can do that. And I was like, yeah, I think we can do some of that, but hold on. And so through quite an extended series of discussions with numerous types of producers, then we ended up coming down to having this human life-size sculpture as the main thread running through the documentary. And so the life-size sculpture will make the invisible microflora on our skin become visible. And so it's a really good visual representation of the bacteria on our skin. And then what they wanted to do then was to use that as a giant experiment, and then from that lead out into other aspects of the documentary. It was quite a challenging discussion because there was starting to be some conflicts around whether this piece was a piece of artwork or whether it's purely there for public engagement sort of activities. And so I think that through that process, there was a considerable extended period of negotiation. And in the end, we let go of some of our control, so we wanted to create a single large sculpture as a single piece. It then became that we were going to divide that piece into two. One half is going to be treated with antibiotics to show how on the skin we have the emergence of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And so we came to a common ground where we could move forward on that documentary. It also opened up some new opportunities, so we started to be able to collaborate with other scientists who they got involved in the documentary, one of those being around phage therapy with the University of Oxford.
So originally, my idea for this kind of sculpture was to do it of myself, but because of working with production and them having a narrative or a goal for that project, we had to change it to making a sculpture of Dr. Michael Mosley. So I think we've missed a slide. So
okay,
I'm going to, these were the drawings. Oh, by the way, there's a hashtag this evening, microbial Michael. But we've messed that up. So the casting process. And I think I've skipped ahead, haven't I?
Yeah, no, that's fine. But so this change in project meant that we had to develop a new way of working. So previously we'd been working on a very small scale. So we've been creating these faces quite small, quite easy to create in the laboratory. And so we were able to work in a very ad hoc kind of way. That Mel would just rock up to the lab, she would say, right, today I would like to try this, that and that, and then we would create those, we'd see what happens. Even when we were doing work for commissioning, so when we were trying to create the exhibit for the Eden project, then we had the flexibility that we could produce many faces. Every face is always original. You can't control how the bacteria are going to grow, and so we could then pick the best one to then exhibit. So this project and the scale of this project meant that we had to work in a very different kind of way.
So it also meant we had to work differently with each other as well.
Yes.
And there were many, many ups and downs throughout that project.
There were, and I was very reluctant to commit myself to the project and that undertaking. You were far more relaxed, is that fair to say?
Yeah, I was like, come on, let's just do it.
Which, in quite a few of our discussions, have always been that way, and I'm much more fixated on practicalities to actually realise that Mel hates me always talking about the logistics. But what actually amazed me during the project was the switch in roles. And so due to the scale of that project, then to actually get me on board, Mel really needed to then, we're going to talk about the
So I had to phone around a lot of people because we had discussions for about 6 months with the production company, and then they said to us, could you do it in a month? And I said, no, give me 6, and they gave us 2. So then from that point I started frantically planning this project to happen in 2 months, and called up lots of places, and I noticed that when you say the word biohazard, they tend not to call you back. So I had to stop saying that. But I eventually got an amazing team. I stopped saying biohazard. Got an amazing team of people together, and the casting team in particular were amazing. And yeah, should I talk about the casting?
Yeah. And so I think what convinced me to get involved in the project was that in 2 weeks, we've been talking about this project for years.
Yeah.
And
since I met you, I think.
Yeah, I think you had that idea, but never really that practicalities of how do you make such a large sculpture that reality. And so by bringing that team together, and particularly I think bringing the casting team together, then we started getting into the real depths of that practicalities.
Yeah, so I think the most interesting point of what I'm going to talk about now is the fact that before we had always made the sculptures upside down, and we'd always kind of poured the agar in and popped it out. But Mark called me and said, can we make it the right way up? And I was like, no, are you mad? And then I spoke to Spacer, the casting company, and they said, yeah, of course you can. So that was, because I'm used to being right about the artistic processes, so that threw me a bit.
I'm the scientist, I know nothing.
So we had to make the casing in 3 steps ahead, and we had to keep working in reverse. And we had to make the base first, and then the silicone mould of it, and then we would pour it from the top for it to fill up. And you can't see through plaster either, so that was very, very difficult. But we had to make sure that this was watertight.
Yeah, and that led on to, I think, the most critical part of the project. So, as you can see here, first they cast the body of Michael, and all the way through this I was saying, Mel, how much agar do you actually need to actually fill this body? And what was your response?
30 litres, maybe, give or take.
Yeah, and I said, well, are you actually measuring that in a sort of precise manner? No, it's sort of by eye, and then you got the water bottles out, and you were sort of saying, his leg's that thick. And,
yeah, I got a litre bottle of water, and I thought that was a really clever way of figuring out, but it's not really.
But this became a really critical point because agar, when we use it in the laboratory, we use it in very small amounts, and you have to treat it in a particular kind of way. It has to be sterilised in order that only the bacteria that you want, and here we only wanted Michael's skin flora to grow. And so you need to sterilise it. And we have these autoclaves, which are like big ovens that you put it into and you sterilise it. And it's okay if you want to sterilise 2 or 3 litres, but Mel was saying 30 litres. And we were working in a different environment, we were working down at Imperial. And we had convinced them that, yeah, 30 litres, it's going to be fine for the project. But as we got closer and closer to the actual day where we were going to film the making of it, then Mel was hiding information from me, and then started to slowly reveal this to me.
In my defence, it was touch and go. I had 2 scientists that I had to convince to stay on the project. And we couldn't do the test to see how much there was until the day before the filming.
Yeah.
So
The schedules were so tight, and so by the time that we actually had the mould there, it was only, it's only 2 or 3.
That was literally on the phone. How much is it?
It was just how much. And so finally we had this Skype call, and then Mel was like, well, maybe it's closer to 60. And so then Andy Edwards at Imperial was like, what do you mean closer? I need to know exactly. She goes, well, I think it's actually 120. And at that point, I just said,
we can't do it.
We can't do it.
So I didn't know that if like that amount of agar, 120 litres, if it was to fall over, break in any way or be exposed, it would have enough bacteria on it to kill someone. So I didn't realise this until you said, no, we can't do it.
And I was having to get all of the risk assessments signed off, and I could convince them 30 litres was okay, but I couldn't convince them beyond that. This was actually very fortunate because then we had to go back to the production company and we had to renegotiate actually a filming schedule. It wasn't very popular telling them at the last minute, but actually they pushed it back by 2 weeks. They really benefited because they could weave more narrative into the filming process. And then we could actually find a solution to this problem of how do we reduce the amount of agar.
Yeah, so we basically built an internal skeleton inside the body to over half cut the agar out, maybe?
Yeah. We reduced the volume easily by half.
So it wouldn't kill anyone.
Yeah, and so it suddenly became much more feasible to actually be able to pour the final sculpture.
So we're going to show you a clip from a video we're making, and it's us pouring the agar, which took about 6 hours, I think.
Yeah, so you had to pour it in there. We're slowly pouring it in. Part of that long delay is the time it takes to autoclave the agar all the way through, because the agar behaves very much like water. Any little small cracks that appear within there, then how do you describe the agar leaking from the sculpture?
It was like pissing out. So it was boiling hot and just, yeah.
Yeah, and then you had to plug the gap, you had to get clay, try and plug where those holes were in order to do it. So it was really challenging.
But then clay is like watery, so that wasn't helping, and then we had to wait for the agar to actually set.
And then you can see that there's plastic around that. That's the actual film set, which looks really great on the documentary, but to work in that environment was so challenging. It was so hot. I mean, it was like working on one of the biomes down at the Eden project. We had lots of people around, and it was just making the whole process. When we've worked together before, we have control over that environment. When you're working with a production crew, it makes everything take far longer. And because of the heat there, then it actually took over 48 hours for that agar to actually solidify and for us to be able to unveil the body.
But we did it, so I'll show you some photos now. So that's the final, that was when we first installed it.
Yeah, so we put it into a specially commissioned casing, and over a period of time, then that casing was going to be filmed. But this was quite an emotional point for you in the process, wasn't it?
Yeah, because when any artist, I think, makes something, you want to spend a lot of time with it and understand it, especially if you haven't got a clue what is growing on it. So as soon as I made it, I had to go to Oxford straight away and do another part of the project, and then there were film cameras around it constantly. So I felt like that had been ripped away from me, and that the artwork was no longer an artwork, it was a prop for a film. So
yeah.
That's a bit,
It created a lot of tensions.
yeah.
The next issue that happened, if you want to move to the
was actually the condensation.
So the film crew had set up a really complex rig to actually do the time lapse capturing the growth of the bacteria. You can see that it's hazy there, and because of the heat that was within the tented environment with all the lights, then the casing just immediately steamed up. And we warned them that that was a risk that was going to happen, but because of the budget restrictions of the project and the time, that we couldn't fit a cooling system into the actual casing to prevent that from happening.
But I see, like, not from a time-lapse point of view, obviously, but from an artistic point of view, it actually adds to the artwork, so it's not, it shows that it's living, and I find that quite interesting, that it adds that to it.
Yes. But explaining that to the production company.
They don't have any of that.
Spent a huge amount of money to try and capture this was frustrating for them, I think, to say the least. But you know, they really did manage to capture great footage. The other crisis happened was that Mel came in at day 4 and said, "Oh, I can smell bacteria." And which meant that the casing, the seals were starting to get compromised, and so the bacteria are at risk of leaking out. And at that point, for health and safety reasons, we had to then terminate the project. So then that was the next difficult conversation with the film crew, who was set up to film this for 2 weeks, to tell them that you've got 8 hours to finish your filming. But they did an amazing job to actually get all of the footage that they needed with the various elements. But a consequence of that was the documentation that we only had.
Yeah, so I mean, for the first day, because obviously I was a bit too early straight away, I think I took 8 photographs, and usually I take about 2,000 photographs of the same thing, but we managed to get a few, but not a great deal. I think on the last day, when it was being thrown away, I took most that day. But
so that was quite a challenge for us. We had invested so much time and effort, and because it being that piece of work that we wanted to create for such a long period of time, to only then spend such a small amount of time with that piece of work, I think was challenging for us.
Yeah.
I mean, it's also challenging for the production company. But if you watch the documentary tomorrow, you'll see.
yeah, so we should actually tell you that the documentary is being aired tomorrow. There's a little promo shot of it. So 9 PM BBC 4, and it's quite interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it is great. I mean, when you're invested in that project and you put so much into it, it is quite bizarre that both of us said, oh, yeah, it's actually quite hard to watch it because we are so involved in it. But actually, as time goes by, then you can actually see, I mean, they've done a fantastic job of building the narrative around the body and the way that they talk about the science and the microbiology. It really shows how the sculpture has really brought this to life.
So I guess we should talk about what we've learned as well in this process.
Okay, so what we've learned is that Mel and I can actually work together.
Really well. I think we fell out once for 2 hours.
Twice, yeah. Phone bills have been very expensive. But the key thing during that time was in the early phases of the project, where I was very unsure about the actual logistics of carrying out the project, that it was Mel who was doing all that reassurance, and she did a fantastic job of getting the right people together in that short period of time to make this a reality. In the later stages of the project, then it was me who was picking Mel up off the floor and saying, come on, we're nearly there, we can get there, we can get there, we can do it. And so because of that, actually, I think our working relationship in that way has been strengthened for that.
Yeah, and I think I'm so happy that we took the opportunity to do this because it's opened up so many doors for us now, and we've managed to acquire 3 more scientists on the project, one who's an immunologist from Manchester, another who wants to visualise viruses, and then some mycologists and people interested in antimicrobial resistance. And we were also given some Arts Council funding as well to push that project forward. So I think it was a good thing, even though it was so stressful that whole time, but there's no point in doing a project if it's not hard.
Yeah.
So,
and one of the lessons that I learned from it as well, that is when you're working with a production company and these types of commissions, then you really have to be very upfront about the nature of the work. And we always were, but they still didn't quite get that this is very experimental, that we didn't quite know what was going to happen. And, so many unexpected things did happen during that project. We made that clear from up front. But even when you do that, there's still the expectations that when you say something's going to happen, it's going to happen in a certain way. And so, I mean, that's something that I would say anybody getting involved in these types of projects to be aware of.
yeah.
But as Mel said, it was such a fantastic opportunity because it suddenly turned this into a reality for us and opened up so many
So it's not over, that's the thing. We're going to probably make another body, but
Yes.
we're not sure yet. We're thinking about it.
Not in the short term.
Well, we can do it in 2 months, so we could
Yeah.
do it in a month.
Yeah, but we now know the process, and so all of that hard work, and I think that that's something through this process, is that also the amount of work that went into being able to create that cast. And if you go to Mel's website, which is going to launch tomorrow evening, if you go to the website, you'll see the time lapse and you'll see the complexity of that process, which I think is phenomenal.
So there are links that we can show you. Mark doesn't have much social media yet, but we'll sort that out.
You had to tweet for me earlier today, that's my phone.
So yeah, the website will launch tomorrow, and there'll be lots of information about the project, and also it's being aired tomorrow night. So
Yeah.
please be in touch with it.
And finally, we should just acknowledge the production company, Renegade Pictures, Michael Mosley for being the willing volunteer within this project, and Andy Edwards and the team at Imperial for providing the space for us to stand up as well.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.